Join me as I dive into this eerie locked room mystery and see if I can uncover the secrets hidden inside. There's something undeniably fascinating about locked room mysteries, that perfect blend of true crime and detective fiction that keeps us on the edge of our seats, wondering how the impossible could have happened. Imagine walking into a room only to find no signs of forced entry or exit, yet the person inside is gone or worse, dead. The suspense is palpable, and our minds immediately start racing with theories and questions. Who could have committed the crime? Was it a cleverly constructed alibi or a genuine impossibility? These are the kinds of puzzles that have captivated us for centuries, and I'm excited to dive into one of the most baffling cases I've come across. In the early morning hours of a winter day, police received a frantic call from the landlord of a small apartment building. One of his tenants, a reclusive young woman, had failed to open her door for breakfast, which was unusual. The landlord, concerned for her well-being, tried the door but found it locked from the inside. The windows were closed, and the only way to enter or exit the room was through that single door. Immediately, the detectives were called in to investigate this eerie scene. As the police officers waited outside, they heard no signs of movement from within, no whispers, no creaks, no hints of life whatsoever. The silence was deafening. Finally, they managed to break down the door, only to find the young woman lying on her bed, cold to the touch. The autopsy revealed she had been dead for at least 24 hours. The room was pristine, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. The investigation that followed was one of the most painstaking and intricate in recent history. The detectives scoured every inch of the room, collecting fibers, fingerprints, and DNA samples, but they found nothing concrete that could lead them to the killer. The victim's background check revealed a quiet, unassuming person with no known enemies or secrets. It seemed she was just an ordinary young woman living an ordinary life, until the day she died under extraordinary circumstances. As the case grew colder, the detectives began exploring alternative theories. Could it have been a cleverly staged suicide, or perhaps a burglary gone wrong? But the more they dug, the more they realized that nothing added up. The room remained a sealed tomb, with its secrets locked within. As the inquiry continued, forensic experts discovered a few faint fingerprints near the window, but they didn't match anyone in the system. It was as if the killer had left behind a cryptic message, taunting the detectives with their presence, yet remaining invisible. The case was turning into a real-life whodunit, and the detectives were no closer to catching the perpetrator. But then, something strange happened. A small, almost imperceptible inconsistency in the victim's background check caught the attention of one of the detectives. It was a tiny thread, but it led them down a rabbit hole of surprises and revelations. Suddenly, the entire case turned on its head, and the detectives found themselves facing a reality that was even more chilling than they had initially suspected. The key twist in this case is so unexpected, so diabolical, that it will leave you speechless. I'll let it sink in for a moment. The person behind the locked door wasn't the only one playing a game of deception. The killer was hiding in plain sight, using the very same tactics that detectives employed to catch their suspects. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and it would have succeeded if not for that tiny inconsistency. In the end, the detectives managed to unravel the threads of this intricate web, but the experience left them shaken. It was a sobering reminder that, no matter how good we think we are at uncovering the truth, there will always be those who are one step ahead, waiting to pounce on our vulnerabilities. Locked room mysteries continue to captivate us because they tap into our darkest fears, the possibility that, despite our best efforts, we can be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and left in the dark. But it's exactly this thrill of the unknown that drives us to keep exploring, to keep seeking answers, and to keep pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible. So, what do you think, guys? Have any theories about this eerie case? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you have any other mysteries you'd like me to cover, let me know. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll be diving into another mind-bending mystery. Part 1. The Vanishing of Madeline Crowley. The call came just after dawn. The air was heavy with the thick, biting chill of winter as Detective Mark Costello parked outside the tenement building on Holloway Avenue. Even from the car, he could see the building's cracked facade and grimy windows, looming like a derelict skeleton over the icy street. Morning light seeped through a hazy sky, casting everything in washed-out gray. There was something unsettling about the quiet. Even the usual city noise was dulled, almost as if something in the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. Mark climbed out, clutching his coat tightly, and greeted the landlord who had been waiting anxiously at the building's front entrance. "It's apartment 6B, the man stammered, glancing over his shoulder with an expression that betrayed both fear and confusion. "I swear, detective, she was a quiet girl. She kept to herself. But it's not right. Show me," Mark replied, his tone flat as he suppressed the eerie tingle running down his spine. He'd seen stranger things in his time on the force, but this case already felt wrong. The chill wasn't just from the weather. They walked up the narrow, creaky stairs, every step echoing in the cold silence of the early morning. When they reached the 6th floor, the landlord pointed at the door to 6B, his hand trembling. It was locked, just as it had been when he tried to open it for her usual breakfast delivery. Mark tried the handle, confirming it was bolted from the inside, then knelt to examine the lock and hinges. There were no signs of forced entry or tampering. He motioned for the landlord to stand back and, with a well-aimed shoulder shove, forced the door open. Inside, the air was stagnant, laden with a faint metallic tang that made Mark's stomach tighten. There was no obvious mess, no immediate sign of a struggle. The room was immaculately clean, as if nothing had ever happened. And there, on the bed, lay the tenant, Madeline Crowley, motionless and pale, her wide-open eyes staring into the void. Mark approached cautiously, noting the unsettling precision with which everything was arranged around her. Every object in the room seemed to be in its perfect place, untouched and pristine. It looked less like a crime scene and more like a macabre exhibit. His partner, Detective Sarah Hennessy, joined him minutes later, her eyes darting around the room, brows furrowed in disbelief. "Locked from the inside," she muttered, surveying the area. "Windows closed, not a single thing out of place." Mark felt the faint prickling of unease crawling along his neck. He hadn't seen any fingerprints on the door or around the lock, and the victim, cold to the touch, had been dead for at least 24 hours, according to the coroner's preliminary report. But as Sarah examined the windows, she paused, her fingers brushing faint smudges near the edges of the glass. Faint fingerprints, barely perceptible. "Mark," she whispered, her voice taut with uncertainty, "whoever or whatever was in here. They were careful, almost like they wanted us to know they were here." The landlord, visibly shaken, glanced around, mumbling under his breath. "I told her not to mess with things." Mark's ears pricked up. "Mess with what?" The landlord's face blanched, his gaze shifting as if realizing he'd said too much. He stumbled backward, muttering something about omens and old curses, before he backed away, leaving the detectives alone in the room. Mark and Sarah exchanged a glance. This wasn't going to be an ordinary investigation. And from that moment, both of them knew that whatever they were dealing with was far darker and more complex than they had anticipated. Part 2. The Secrets of Room 6B. Mark and Sarah scoured the apartment for clues, every minute detail observed in painstaking silence. The room was eerily quiet, its emptiness echoing the feeling in Mark's gut. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. A stack of books lay on the nightstand, neatly arranged with a small notebook on top, still open to a page of tidy handwriting. Madeline Crowley's life, as far as her landlord and neighbors knew, had been uneventful. She had moved into years prior and kept mostly to herself. No friends visited, no family called. She'd gone about her days as an invisible tenant, clocking in at a nearby bookstore during the day and returning home by evening. A faint sense of loneliness permeated the room, as though her isolation had seeped into the very walls. Sarah flipped through the notebook, her face pinched in concentration. She kept notes on everything: appointments, random thoughts, even some strange entries. Mark glanced over her shoulder. The handwriting was small and deliberate, each word penned with a cautious neatness. "Read one," he urged. Sarah hesitated, then picked an entry from 2 weeks before. "I feel watched, but I know it's impossible. I've double-checked the windows, doors, and even the vents. No one could be watching me. Still, I can't shake the feeling. When I close my eyes, it feels like someone is standing right over me." She flipped to a newer entry, greater than. Asterisk, "This room hums at night. There's something beneath the quiet, a low buzz that makes my skin crawl. I've tried earplugs, sleeping pills, but the noise gets louder. I don't know how much longer I can take it. Maybe I need to leave. Maybe it's time to go." Asterisk. Mark frowned. "You think she was hearing things? Some kind of auditory hallucination?" "Possibly," Sarah murmured. "Or maybe she wasn't alone in here after all." Mark examined the faint smudges near the window. They didn't form any recognizable pattern, just brief, ghostly imprints, as if someone had pressed their fingers there for only a moment. He opened the window, letting in a sharp gust of wind, and peered outside. From 6 stories up, the view was bleak, an endless sprawl of alleyways and rooftops. Would have been impossible for anyone to climb up here, he muttered. Even more impossible to leave. But the faint, nearly invisible fingerprints lingered in his mind. They didn't belong to Madeline. Her body had been untouched, and there was no record of her attempting to escape. As if sensing his growing unease, Sarah placed her hand on the notebook and closed it. Let's see if there's anything more to find here. She moved to the small dresser, opening each drawer and sifting through folded clothes and personal belongings. She reached the bottom drawer and froze. Nestled beneath a few sweaters was an envelope, the paper crinkled and yellowed with age. Across its face, in hurried handwriting, were the words, for Detective Mark Costello, The handwriting wasn't Madeline's, it was shaky, and even, as if scrawled in haste. Mark's blood ran cold. He had never met Madeline Crowley, had never even heard her name until that morning, so there was no earthly reason why she would have an envelope addressed to him. Sarah, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at him, eyes wide, and handed him the envelope. Mark could feel a subtle tremor in his hands as he opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. On it, in the same spidery handwriting, were 3 lines. Room 6B is not what it seems. It will call you back. The thing in the room always watches. Mark folded the letter, fighting the dread pooling in his stomach. He had seen strange cases before, but this was something different, something older, as though whatever force was at work here had been waiting a long time. We need more information on this building, he said, slipping the note into his coat pocket. If there's a record of anything unusual about this room, we have to find it. Sarah agreed, but there was a weariness in her gaze. You think she was leaving us a message? But how? She's been dead a full day. I don't know, Mark replied, glancing over his shoulder at the vacant room. But I get the feeling that we're just scratching the surface. As they left, Mark felt an odd pull, an invisible thread tying him back to the room. He shook it off, though the sensation stayed with him, an unshakable weight pressing on his shoulders. Part 3. The Voices of Holloway Avenue. The building records, housed in the city archives, were easy to access but far from comforting. As Mark and Sarah sifted through stacks of files and old blueprints, they found the tenants of 6B kept a hauntingly brief history. Every 2 years, almost like clockwork, the room became available as its occupant either moved out abruptly or met an untimely end. The oldest record they could find dated back to 1926, when a young woman named Harriet Langston had been found dead under circumstances almost identical to Madeline's. In each instance, the deaths were noted as mysterious, with no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no logical explanation. The coroner's reports were chillingly similar. Deceased for at least 24 hours, no physical trauma, eyes open, as though staring into something unknown. Mark laid out the reports on a table. It's almost as if the room has a cycle. Every 2 years, it lets people in, but then, it's not a room, Sarah muttered, studying a faded blueprint from the building's construction. It's a trap. Mark looked up. What do you mean? Sarah tapped her finger on an older blueprint. Look. Every apartment has a slight variation in floor space, except for 6B. The room is listed as smaller than the others, yet every new set of blueprints shows no change. It's as if the room itself is shifting, taking space from somewhere. Space from where? Mark asked, unable to shake the creeping sense of dread. Sarah swallowed. Or something? They exchanged a glance, both unwilling to voice the obvious. But Mark's mind had already wandered there. Was there something alive? In the walls, or beneath the floorboards of 6B. Something lying in wait, feeding on the lives of those unlucky enough to inhabit it. It was nearing midnight when they left the archives, both feeling hollowed by what they'd uncovered. Outside, the street lamps cast their wan light onto Holloway Avenue, illuminating the cold, empty street. Mark stopped at the entrance to the building, an odd sensation tingling along his arms. Mark, let's call it a night, Sarah said, glancing nervously at the tenement's shadowed windows. He nodded, though he knew sleep would be impossible. I'll just do one last sweep of 6B tomorrow, see if there's anything we missed. Sarah hesitated, her eyes filled with concern. Be careful. I don't know if it's the room or what's in it, but this case, it's already claimed too many lives. Mark watched her leave, his mind a jumble of unease and reluctant resolve. She was right, There was something terribly wrong with that room. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he was being called back, as if a tether, invisible yet unbreakable, tied him to 6B. That night, Mark dreamt of the room. In his dream, he stood alone within its four walls, a faint hum filling the air. Shadows moved along the edges, shifting and twisting like smoke. He could feel something watching him, a gaze so intense it burned through the darkness. In the dream, he reached out to touch the wall, and it pulsed beneath his hand, alive and breathing. Then he heard a voice, a soft, lilting whisper that sent chills racing down his spine. It sounded like Madeline, yet twisted, as if filtered through layers of static. Asterisk, it sees you, detective. It waits for you. Asterisk. He woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding. The voice lingered in his mind, a ghostly echo he couldn't shake. The next morning, as he approached 6B, Mark felt that same eerie pull, a magnetic force drawing him closer. He entered the room alone, closing the door softly behind him. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. Mark reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the letter addressed to him, and reread the words. Asterisk, the thing in the room always watches. Asterisk. He'd read the line a dozen times, but today, it felt real, as if the room itself were aware of him. Slowly, he walked over to the bed where Madeline had been found, feeling the weight of her final moments pressing down on him. The notebook was still there, its spine slightly cracked. On an impulse, he flipped to the very last page, finding an entry that hadn't been there the day before. Asterisk, I told them not to open the walls. Asterisk. Mark blinked, disbelief flooding his mind. He remembered Sarah's theory, her suggestion that perhaps the room wasn't just a room but a vessel for something far older and more dangerous. Something bound, buried, perhaps long forgotten. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of movement. He turned, but the room was empty. Yet, as he turned back, he saw it, a faint outline on the wall, barely visible yet unmistakable, a handprint, slowly forming in the dust, right over the spot where he had touched in his dream. It was a small hand, delicate and pale, almost like Madeline's, and it was reaching toward him. Part 4. The Unseen Presence. Mark staggered back, his gaze locked on the ghostly handprint. His pulse hammered as he watched it darken, taking on a reddish hue as if smeared with dried blood. He knew he should turn and leave, but his legs refused to move, a chill seeping into his bones, anchoring him to the spot. The silence thickened, the kind that swallowed sound, the kind that smothered life. The air grew colder, and a soft rustling sound echoed from the walls, as if something unseen shifted within them. Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. Who, or what are you? He whispered, his voice barely a rasp. The handprint remained, taunting him. As if in response, the faint humming he'd heard in his dream filled the room, a low, insistent buzz that seemed to vibrate within his skull. The hum grew louder, pulsing in time with his heartbeat, a dreadful rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Suddenly, a whisper broke through the hum, thin and sharp. It was Madeline's voice, or rather, something trying to sound like her. The pitch was wrong, distorted, as though strained through broken glass. They shouldn't have opened the wall. The words clawed at him, twisting into his mind like cold fingers. Mark knew he should leave, but the voice had hooked him, pulling him deeper. He found himself kneeling next to the wall, his fingers tracing the outline of the faint, reddish stain. The handprint was cold beneath his touch, almost freezing, and he felt his hand tremble. Just then, there was a muffled sound, a thud from behind the wall. Mark jerked his hand back, watching as the dust shifted, and then stilled. He froze, his mind racing. What if there was something or someone trapped inside? His fingers found a faint seam in the wall, almost imperceptible beneath the layers of paint and plaster. He dug his fingers into it, pulling away crumbling bits until he could wedge his fingers in deeper. He pulled harder, the wall's surface giving way with a crackling sound. Behind the thin plaster, he saw an empty space, a hollowed-out pocket no bigger than a crawl space, shrouded in darkness. The faint smell of mildew and something else, something decayed and metallic, wafted out, nearly gagging him. He reached into his coat for his flashlight, clicking it on and shining it into the opening. The beam illuminated something that made his stomach drop, a small bundle of parchment, stained and fragile, bound together with brittle twine. Next to it lay a single, withered rose, its petals blackened and dry. The air in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating, as if something ancient and malevolent had been awakened. Mark took a deep breath and reached inside, carefully pulling out the bundle of parchment. As he held it in his hands, he noticed words scrawled across the top page, faded and smudged. He leaned closer, his heart pounding as he read. To those who disturb this resting place, beware, for the walls hold secrets that should never see the light. The words seemed to crawl off the page, each letter imbued with a latent malice that sent shivers racing down his spine. He flipped through the pages, each one filled with frantic handwriting detailing a ritual, instructions for binding something dark. He read a few lines, his blood running cold. The spirit is bound by silence and stone, only to be freed by touch and sound. The watcher waits behind the walls, hungering, waiting. It takes from those who seek it. He stopped reading, dread pooling in his gut. Madeline's obsession with the walls, her paranoia, her tragic end, it all made sense now. She had somehow discovered these papers, read the forbidden words, perhaps even attempted the ritual. And in doing so, she had unleashed something. Mark felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, an unmistakable awareness that he was no longer alone. He turned slowly, flashlight in hand, illuminating the empty room. But there, in the shadows, he saw a faint figure standing by the bed, draped in darkness. Its eyes, hollow and deep, locked onto his with a hunger that seemed to seep into his bones. It's been waiting, the figure's whisper clawed into his mind. He stepped back, his body instinctively moving toward the door, his flashlight trembling in his grip. But the figure moved with him, gliding through the darkness, its twisted form shrouded in shadows. It wore the outline of Madeline's figure, but something was wrong. The limbs were too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. Mark's fingers found the door handle, and he fumbled, his gaze locked onto the figure. But as he turned the knob, he realized with growing horror that the door wouldn't budge. It was as if some force held it shut, trapping him inside with the creature. The humming grew louder, the walls seeming to vibrate with a life of their own. The shadows swirled, enveloping the room in darkness, until only the faint glow of his flashlight remained. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heartbeat a frantic drumbeat echoing through his veins. And then, in the silence, he heard a whisper, a familiar voice, close to his ear. "Detective Costlow, it's been waiting for you, it knows you can't leave." The voice was a grotesque mimicry of Madeline's, a cruel mockery, and Mark's hand tightened around the flashlight, knowing it was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. He felt the walls closing in, felt the cold, creeping tendrils of whatever presence had been awakened. The thing stepped closer, and Mark backed away until his spine pressed against the unyielding wall. He knew there was no way out, knew that whatever lurked in this room had been waiting for this moment, waiting to finally have him. And then, with a horrible certainty, he understood. Madeline hadn't been the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The room had always been a trap, a vessel to feed the thing that watched from the walls, its hunger bound by ancient words, waiting for someone curious enough, desperate enough, to look behind the veil. Mark's grip faltered, the flashlight clattering to the floor. The last thing he saw was the shadow of the figure, stretching toward him, its hollow eyes filled with endless hunger. Part 5. The Last Words. 2 days after Detective Mark Costlow vanished, Detective Sarah Hennessy returned to the apartment on Holloway Avenue. She'd called his cell a dozen times, left voicemails, and even filed a missing persons report, but Mark had simply disappeared. His car remained parked outside the building, untouched, and a subtle chill settled over Holloway Avenue, as if the street itself sensed a dark presence. Sarah had returned to 6B not out of protocol, but because of something nagging at her, a pull similar to the one Mark had described. She couldn't explain it, but she felt that if she didn't confront whatever was in that room, she might never understand what had happened to him. The landlord met her at the building entrance, his face gaunt. "You shouldn't go in there, detective," he warned, his voice low and taut. "Whatever took her, it's still in there, and it's not finished." But Sarah, driven by a deep and unsettling conviction, ignored his warning. She climbed the stairs to the 6th floor, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. The silence felt thick, pressing in on her, and the closer she got to the room, the more she felt the weight of something watching her. The door to 6B was ajar, as if beckoning her inside. Sarah stepped in cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the still pristine room. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and Mark's notebook lay on the nightstand beside the bed. She approached it slowly, her fingers brushing against the cover. Just as she touched it, the air changed, thickening with an unseen presence. A low hum began to vibrate through the room, the same hum Mark had described, though she'd never heard him mention it. The floor felt colder, the walls somehow pressing closer, as if the room itself was alive, inhaling her presence. Sarah flipped open the notebook, her heart beating wildly. The last page Mark had read was still open, the words scrawled in a desperate, shaky hand. The thing in the room always watches. She exhaled, swallowing back her fear. And then she noticed another entry, something that hadn't been there before. Written in shaky, hurried script, it read, "The walls are its mouth, and it feeds on fear. If you hear it, leave. If you see it, it's too late." The hum grew louder, pulsing with a dark rhythm. Her hand shook as she backed away from the knit stand, her gaze fixed on the far wall. It was there, faint but unmistakable, the shadow of a handprint, darker than before, as if marked in fresh blood. A voice broke the silence, thin and breathy, echoing through the room. It was Mark's voice or something close to it, twisted with a cruel, mocking tone. "Sarah, it's been waiting for you." She turned, her pulse racing, her flashlight darting across the walls, but the room was empty. And yet, she could feel its an oppressive weight, a presence that had no form, no face, but was there all the same. She tried to push back the rising terror, feeling a suffocating tightness in her chest as she reached for the door. But the door had closed, sealing her inside. The hum escalated, filling her mind with a relentless, agonizing buzz, and the walls seemed to ripple, as though something were clawing its way out from behind them. She screamed, pounding on the door, but her voice was swallowed by the thick, stifling silence. And then, she heard it, a faint whisper from within the walls, a soft, taunting breath against her ear. "It's hungry, Sarah. It always has been." She turned to see the shadowed figure looming in the corner, its hollow eyes fixed on her, a twisted smile stretching across its inhuman face. It was Mark, or at least the shell of him, his face contorted, his limbs twisted into something unnatural. The room seemed to pulse in response, as if the thing in the walls fed on the fear now radiating from her. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she could see other faces in the shadows, other victims, twisted and hollowed out by whatever fed on them. Harriet Langston, Madeline Crowley, and now Mark, his eyes empty, his soul devoured by the darkness within these walls. As the shadows closed in, Sarah felt a frigid hand clasp her shoulder, pulling her back into the depths of the room. Her scream was smothered by the silence, and the last thing she heard was the voice, cold and triumphant. "Another life, another offering. The watcher waits for the next." In the morning, the door to 6B was wide open, the room as pristine as ever. No trace of Detective Costello or Hennessy was ever found. The landlord said nothing, only shook his head with a sad, knowing look when questioned. But the neighbors began whispering about the strange occurrences in 6B, about the eerie pull, and the feeling that someone was always watching. The apartment remained empty for a few weeks until a new tenant, a quiet young man, moved in, unaware of the room's dark history. And as he settled into bed on his first night, a faint hum filled the silence, and the walls seemed to watch. For in Holloway Avenue 6B, the watcher always waited, patient and ever hungry, for the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek its secrets.